If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button before we begin, because this one is going to stay with you. The gunshot came from somewhere inside the auction hall, then another, then screaming. The kind that doesn't perform itself, the kind that tears out of a person before their mind catches up with what their body already knows. Ifunanya Easy had been walking the corridor on the 4th floor of the Grand Hyatt Busan when the first shot fired. She'd been on the phone with Lagos. Doctor, Ida Dai is telling her that the Okafor boy had made it through the night, that his oxygen was holding, and the relief had barely settled in her chest before everything changed. She spun toward the sound. A hand closed around her arm. She was moved, not dragged, not thrown, moved with the kind of controlled force that didn't waste a single ounce of itself, and her back met marble before her brain processed that she was no longer standing in the corridor. An alcove, a man, charcoal suit, no tie, and dark eyes that did not blink. He pressed one forearm across her collarbone, not enough to hurt, more than enough to pin, and his voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Say nothing. If they realize you saw my face, you won't leave this floor alive. Ifunanya looked at him, then she looked down. His left side, just beneath the jacket, a dark bloom spreading through the white of his dress shirt, growing wider even as she watched. She looked back up at his face. Then move, she said quietly. You're bleeding. He went very still. For a moment, just one, something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Not surprise exactly. Something older than surprise. Then shouts from around the corner. Footsteps, fast and multiplying. The sound of men who were looking for something. He shifted his weight and the alcove swallowed them both deeper into shadow. Her conference badge swung between them on its lanyard. Any Global Trade Medical Summit. Participant. Day 2, neither of them breathed. The footsteps passed. Then one set stopped, turned back. She felt Seakyong's hand tighten on her arm. Not a warning, a reflex. And a voice spoke from the corridor, close enough that she could have reached through the shadow and touched its owner. The voice said something in Korean. Slow, deliberate. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. In the way a question sounds when it already knows the answer. When it's not asking, it's confirming. And then from somewhere deeper in the building, another voice called back. The footsteps resumed and faded. Seakyong released a breath that was too small to be called a breath. She stayed very still. What did he say? She whispered. A pause. When he answered, his voice had something in it she would only later identify as the specific weight of a man delivering bad news with full composure. He said, the woman with the conference badge, we have her name. The cold started at the back of her neck and moved slowly downward. She looked up at him. They already have my name, she said. Yes. From the attendee list, yes. Which means, she stopped. Processed. Let the logic complete itself, because logic was what she worked with. And the logic here was, you cannot leave quietly. You cannot leave safely. The moment you step back into this building as yourself, you are already known. Leaving was no longer simple. She understood that now. Not as a threat he had made, as a fact she had just arrived at herself. Her conference badge swung once between them and went still. 36 hours earlier, Busan received her like it received most things, with controlled indifference. The airport was efficient. The signage was exact. The taxi driver spoke no English and she spoke no Korean, and they navigated the 20-minute ride to the hotel in a silence that was almost comfortable. Ifunanya watched the city through the window. She had seen port cities before. Lagos, of course, always Lagos, sprawling and loud and alive in a way that made your chest ache. And Port Harcourt, and once Mombasa, which had smelled of salt and old trade routes and reminded her of things she couldn't quite name. Busan was different. Busan was composed. Even the chaos here had structure to it. Container ships moved through the harbor in organized lanes. The highway curved along coastline that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood the relationship between beauty and power. She pressed 2 fingers to the window glass and thought, this city knows what it is. She respected that. Her name was Ifunanya Chinyere Easy, 29 years old. pediatric trauma surgeon, University of Nigeria Teaching Hospital, Enugu. She had been selected, out of 43 applicants from across sub-Saharan Africa, for a 3-week fellowship attached to the Global Trade Medical Summit. Her participation involved 2 clinical observation days at Inje University Busan Pike Hospital, 3 days at the summit itself attending trauma response workshops, and a final presentation to an international panel on resource-limited surgical intervention. She had prepared for 18 months. She had not prepared for Dr. Min-hee Kwan. Dr. Kwan was the fellowship coordinator. She was small, precise, and warm in the way that very organized people are warm, within acknowledged parameters. She met Ifunanya at the hotel lobby with a printed schedule and a smile that flickered for just a moment when she saw her. "Dr. Ease," she said, "welcome. Yes, you are taller than your photograph." "People often say that." Ifunanya smiled back. Easy. She had learned many years ago that her body announced itself before she did. She had spent a long time deciding how to feel about that. She had decided, fine. It was fine. Her body communicated substantial and here, and not going anywhere. She could work with that. In the elevator, 2 other fellowship participants joined them. Dr. Raj Mehta from Mumbai and Dr. Camille Fontaine from Brussels. Both young, both sharp, both friendly in the slightly competitive way of people who had been selected from large applicant pools and were still figuring out where they stood. Camille looked at Ifunanya with that specific kind of curiosity that wanted to be polite and wasn't quite managing it. "Are you staying for the social program?" Camille asked. "There are investor mixers in the evenings, very exclusive circles. Korean business culture is quite particular about—" She trailed off, smiled, adjusted her blazer. "About what?" Ifunanya asked pleasantly. "Oh, just, aesthetics, first impressions. You know how these things are." "I do," Ifunanya said. She understood exactly what Camille was not quite saying, the shape of the comment, the carefully unfinished sentence. "You may not fit here the way we fit here." She had heard versions of it her whole life. In London during her residency, in Geneva at the WHO consultation, one in the faces of people who looked at her and did a quick calculation and came up uncertain. She filed it, not as a wound, as data. She was a surgeon. Data was what she worked with. The hospital on the first day was where she felt most like herself. The attending who shadowed her, Dr. Park Jin-ho, pediatric surgery, 43 years old, no patience for wasted time, watched her work through 2 case reviews and 1 observational procedure. And by the end of the 2nd hour, he had stopped explaining things to her and started asking her questions instead. "In resource-limited environments," he said, reviewing a scan, "what's your first decision tree when anesthesia supply is inconsistent?" She answered him, specifically, with examples. He nodded once, which she understood was the equivalent of applause. By the end of day 1, she had 3 colleagues who respected her completely and 1 who was still processing. Normal ratio. She could work with that. She had dinner alone at a restaurant near the harbor where she ordered by pointing and received something remarkable. A clay pot of something warm and complex that tasted like a decision. She ate all of it, ordered another dish, watched the ships move through the dark water. Her phone buzzed. Her mother from Enugu. "Mom, Ifunanya, are you eating?" She smiled at the screen. "Ife. Yes, Mama." "I'm eating." "Mom, Korean food? That is fine. Just make sure it has protein. Konurban and call your father. He is pretending he doesn't want to hear from you, but he does." She put the phone down and looked at the harbor and felt for a moment the particular texture of being far from home, but not lost. There was a difference. She had learned to live in that difference. Tomorrow was the summit. She did not know then that tomorrow, a man she had never met already had her name in a file. Han Seakyong did not attend events. He arrived at them. When Seakyong entered a space, the space reorganized itself around him. Not because he demanded it, not because he asked, but because the density of his presence made reorganization the rational response. He was 36 years old. He controlled Han Logistics Group, which officially operated maritime shipping across 7 major Pacific trade corridors. Unofficially, Well, he controlled the security contracts of 4 private infrastructure firms, the import clearance timelines of at least a dozen smaller operators, and, through relationships that didn't appear on any public document, the outcome of several Port Authority decisions that shaped billions of dollars annually. He was not loud about any of this. Loudness was for people who needed to be believed. He arrived at the Global Trade Medical Summit on its second morning because he had a meeting scheduled in the restricted investor wing on the 4th floor. His assistant, Park Tae-jin, walked 2 steps behind him with a tablet. "The Meridian Group representatives arrive at 1400, Tae-jin said. "Move them to 1530. "The corridor clearance? "I'm aware." They entered the main reception hall. Industry people, medical delegates, a scattering of NGO representatives. Seakyong recognized both money and expertise and was interested in neither today. He accepted a glass of water from a passing server, and then he saw her. She was standing near the window with a small plate of food, looking at the harbor. Everyone else in the room was tracking something. The ones looking for opportunity, the ones managing anxiety, the ones performing comfort they didn't feel. She wasn't tracking anything. She had arrived at her own specific conclusions about this room and found them satisfactory enough to stop evaluating and simply exist in. No one had that posture at these events. He watched her for 11 seconds, 10 seconds longer than he usually watched anyone, without a reason. She turned from the window, saw him looking at her, and nothing. Her expression didn't change. She didn't straighten, didn't drop her gaze, didn't smile the smile people smiled at him, the careful, calibrated smile of people trying to figure out what he wanted. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at the harbor. Then she looked away. He turned back to Tae-jin. "Who is the woman by the north window?" Tae-jin checked within 15 seconds. "Dr. Ifunanya Eze, pediatric trauma surgeon, fellowship participant from University of Nigeria Teaching Hospital, Enugu. Medical delegate." "Yes." Seakyong nodded and moved on. He had a logic problem to solve before his afternoon meeting. But for the rest of that morning, without deciding to, he noted where she was in the room. She ate everything on her plate. She asked the panel speaker one question, sharp, clinical, slightly uncomfortable, and nodded at the answer without softening the nod. She laughed once, genuinely, at something the Mumbai doctor said. She never looked back at Seakyong. He found this unreasonably interesting. What he did not know, what he would not discover until later, was that Tae-jin had run a routine attendee flag on her name the moment he requested it, and that the same flag had been noted automatically by a separate intelligence system that monitored Han Logistics personnel movements, a system that did not belong to Han Seakyong. The flag went somewhere it should not have gone, and Yang Min-seok, on the other side of the city, received a notification that evening that simply read, "Han Seakyong has taken interest in a fellowship attendee, Dr. Ifunanya Eze, Enugu, Nigeria." Min-seok stared at the notification for a moment. Then he forwarded it to his operations lead with a single instruction. Full file. Everything. He didn't know why yet. He just knew that Han Seakyong's interest in anything was information worth owning. If you're already feeling the tension, good. Subscribe so you don't lose this. And keep watching, because what happens next changes everything. It happened because of the Okafor boy. Specifically, it happened because Dr. Adais called Ifunanya at 7:30 in the evening during the summit's restricted investor reception to report that the boy's fever had returned and his oxygen was dropping again. Ifunanya stepped out of the reception hall immediately and walked further down the corridor than she meant to, looking for quiet, looking for that quality of open air that made phone calls about dying children slightly more bearable. "So talk to me," she said. "What are his readings?" She turned a corner. Different corridor. No carpet, marble, service adjacent. She registered distantly that she'd gone further than intended. "Okay, that's a post-op inflammatory response," she was saying, and then she stopped. Because the corridor ended in a T-junction 10 meters ahead, and at the junction, 2 men stood facing a third. They were not speaking. A small metal case changed hands. One man accepted it with a very slight bow. Not a social bow, a hierarchical one, the kind that acknowledged an order of things. The man who had received the case turned his head. Dark suit, controlled stillness. Han Seok-ryong. He saw her the same moment she saw him. For 2 full seconds, no one moved. Dr. Ease? Dr. Adazi's voice came through the phone. Are you there? I have to call you back, Ifunanya said, and lowered the phone. She registered several things quickly. When the order that a person trained to assess situations rapidly would register them. The men's posture, which had shifted from transactional to alert. The metal case, which had disappeared. The absence of staff in this corridor, which was deliberate. And Seok-ryong, who was looking at her with an expression that she could only describe as calculation. Then, sound. From somewhere behind the wall, a crack, sharp and unambiguous. A gunshot. And then she was moving, being moved, and her back met marble. Then move, she had said. You're bleeding. He had gone still. The secured safe room on the 3rd floor, 40 minutes later, was small and functional. 2 men guarded the door. Taijin stood close to Seok-ryong, monitoring. The wound in Seok-ryong's side had been the result of a ricochet fragment during the initial exchange in the auction wing, and it was deep enough to require attention, but not, she assessed, immediately catastrophic. He was sitting in a chair, jacket removed. His shirt was dark with blood on the left side, and he was holding a folded cloth against the wound with practiced steadiness. You need a suture, not a cloth, Ifunanya said. He looked at her. I'm aware. Then why haven't you asked me to do it? I'm a surgeon. You're a pediatric surgeon. Trauma. The tissue doesn't know how old the patient is. She set down the water glass they'd given her and crossed the room. Taijin, I need a medical kit. Something comprehensive. Boil whatever instruments aren't already sterile and bring me clean towels and light. Taijin looked at Seok-ryong. Seok-ryong looked at her for a long moment. Then, do what she says. She worked cleanly and quickly and without narration. This was her habit. She operated in a focused quiet that people watching her found slightly unnerving. The absence of reassurance, the presence of complete attention. Seok-ryong watched her work. He didn't wince when the local anesthetic went in, and he didn't wince when she began. You're going to feel pressure, she said. I can see that. I'm telling you anyway. 11 minutes later, she set down the last instrument and covered the wound. You're going to be fine, she said. Stay still for 30 minutes minimum. If you start running security operations on that side before 48 hours, I'll be annoyed, and I have a feeling you don't want that. He looked at her steadily. You have a feeling. Strong one. She peeled off the gloves. Now, someone explain to me what I walked into, and don't make it political or I'll walk out of this room and take my chances with whoever is in the building, because at least their motives will be simple. The silence in the room was complete. Then from the chair, slowly, Taijun, give us the room. They were alone. Ifunanya stood with her arms folded. Not from defensiveness, but from the practical need to do something with her hands while she waited. What you witnessed, he said, was a transaction that doesn't exist on paper. The people who conducted it represent a competing network. They attempted an intervention tonight because they believe certain infrastructure agreements are being finalized that will remove them from a significant portion of their operating revenue. In plain language, and she said, in plain language, there are men in this city who have built their wealth on routes they don't legally own. Tonight, they decided to remind me that they can reach me. And the encrypted drive? A pause. Shipping records. Certain shipping records have become very valuable recently. She absorbed this. And I walked into the corridor at precisely the wrong moment. Yes. And now I'm a problem you need to manage. You are a variable I didn't account for. That's a more honest way to put it. She unfolded her arms. What happens now? Now you are temporarily relocated to a secure residential tower while my team resolves the situation. Your safety cannot be guaranteed in the hotel. The men who launched tonight's attempt already have your name. She was quiet for a moment. One on that phrase, already have your name, sat differently now than it would have an hour ago. No, she said. He blinked, actually blinked. No, she confirmed. You don't get to decide safety for me. I don't know you. I don't know your network or your people or what resolve the situation means in your vocabulary. I have a fellowship I came here to complete, and a hospital in Nigeria that needs me functional. So before I go anywhere with anyone, you're going to give me 3 things. He waited. Full explanation of what I've actually walked into, not the version that manages me, the real one. Communication access to my hospital, unmonitored at times I choose, and you will not make decisions about my movement without my agreement. The silence stretched. You're negotiating with me, he said. I'm establishing term, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long time, not with irritation, with the careful reordering of an equation that had produced an unexpected result. I'll give you 2 of the 3, he said. Full explanation and communication access. Your movement during the active threat period, I cannot negotiate on. Why? Because the men who have your name tonight will not distinguish between your preferences and your location. She considered this. Fine, she said, but the moment the threat is contained, that changes. Agreed. She nodded once. Then start talking. The residential tower was on the western edge of the harbor district. 42 floors that said money and privacy without announcing either. Seakyong's people had a secured floor, the 38th, and Funanya was given a suite with a view of the water that she didn't have time to appreciate. She called Dr. Adas at midnight. The Okafor boy, she said immediately. Where are we? Fever's down. He stabilized around 2100. She let out a breath. Good. Oh, watch his liver enzymes. I want numbers every 6 hours. Are you all right? You sound different. I'm fine. Everything's fine. Keep me updated. She ended the call and stood at the window. The harbor was dark except for the movement of ships. She watched them and thought about routes, about the weight of infrastructure, of systems moving beneath visible surfaces. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Local. She stared at it for 3 full seconds. She answered. Silence first. Just breath, composed, deliberate. The silence of someone who had decided to make contact and was choosing the exact weight of their first word. Then, Dr. Ease. The voice was smooth, unhurried. It did not introduce itself, which was its own kind of introduction. The confidence of a man who assumed he was already known. Yes, she said carefully. I understand you've had a difficult evening. A pause. I want you to know that the difficulty was not directed at you personally, and you have simply found yourself in an unfortunate geography. Who is this? Someone who is curious about you. Another pause. Specifically curious about why you stayed. Her hand tightened slightly on the phone. Stayed where? She said, keeping her voice level. In the building, after what you saw. The voice carried something that might have been genuine interest and might have been the performance of it. A woman in your position, a medical delegate, you're entirely uninvolved, should have left, should have gone back to her hotel room and made decisions about what she had and hadn't witnessed. A soft sound, not quite a laugh. But here you are, on the 38th floor, which tells me something. The cold moved through her slowly. He knew the floor. What does it tell you, she said, that you are either very loyal or very curious. And since you have only known Han Seakyong for approximately 3 hours? A deliberate pause. I suspect curiosity. She said nothing. I'm not calling to threaten you, Dr. Ease. I'm calling because I find you interesting, and because interesting people deserve the courtesy of knowing they've been noticed. Another pause. Good night. Sleep well. The line went dead. She stood at the window for a long moment. Then she set the phone down, walked to the door, and knocked on the wall panel that connected to Taijin's station in the corridor. Honey, I need to speak to him, she said when Taijin appeared. Now. And you need to know that Min Seok just called my personal number. Taijin's expression did not change, but his eyes did. How long ago, he said. 90 seconds. He was already on his radio before she finished the sentence. Seokyong's response to the phone call was immediate and total. By morning, additional security had been arranged, communication protocols tightened, and Funanya's schedule for the remaining summit days had been, without her input, restructured. She found the new schedule on the table when she came to the common area. She read it once, then she put it down. No, she said. Seokyong looked up from his own documents. Asked, the hospital days have been removed for your... The hospital days are non-negotiable. Min Seok called your personal phone last night, which means he already knows I'm here, which means staying in this tower doesn't make me safer. It just makes me less informed. She sat down across from him. Dr. Park Jin-ho is expecting me. I have observations to complete and a presentation to build. Dinner, those things are happening. You're not understanding the level of... I am understanding it completely. Her voice was even, not raised, not brittle, just fixed. I understand that a man called me last night to tell me he was watching. I understand what that means. I also understand that my professional life is not a casualty of your business conflict. She looked at him steadily. You agreed to my terms. Movement decisions require my agreement. I'm not agreeing to this. He set down his pen. Something moved through his expression, and she recognized it because she had seen it before in men who were accustomed to being the final word in a room. It was the reflex, the momentary tightening of authority around the instinct to override. He was deciding whether to override her. She held his gaze and waited. The decision took 4 seconds. The hospital, he said finally, will have a 2-person security presence. Unmarked, non-intrusive. They accompany you in transit only. Agreed. You don't go anywhere in the building without notifying Tajin first. Agreed. And if the threat level changes, then we renegotiate, she said. Together. He looked at her for a long moment. The reflex had passed. What replaced it was harder to name, something adjacent to reluctant respect. The look of a man who had expected to win an argument and had arrived instead at a different kind of outcome entirely. Together, he repeated. Yes, she picked up the schedule and crossed out the hospital cancellations. Tell me about Min Seok, she said. All of it, not the managed version. He talked for 40 minutes. She listened without interrupting, which she suspected was something he was not used to. Being listened to without someone managing their reaction, without the careful calibration of a person deciding how much understanding to display. Jung Min Seok was 38 years old. 14 years ago, he and Seakyong had been 22 and 24, and they had built the skeleton of what would become Han Logistics out of a shared understanding of how Pacific trade routes worked, specifically how the gaps between legitimate oversight could be used to move cargo faster, cheaper, and with less friction than established players. They had been brilliant at it. They had built something real. The divergence came 7 years in. Seok-ryong had wanted to legitimize. So to convert the infrastructure they'd built into something that operated above the surface, that could sustain itself without depending on the vulnerabilities of irregular oversight. Min Seok had not. He had looked at what they'd built and seen not a foundation but a mechanism. And he had decided that the most efficient use of a mechanism that moved things invisibly was to move things that needed to be invisible. They had dissolved the partnership in a single meeting. 14 years of building, he dissolved in 40 minutes. He took 3 corridors, Seok-ryong said, routes we'd built together. He had operational knowledge I couldn't revoke. And he's been using them since. Yes. For what kind of cargo? A pause. Not always the same things. Pharmaceuticals are useful. They provide legitimate cover for transit frequencies. But the manifests don't always match the cargo. She was quiet. People? She said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She sat with that for a moment. He called me last night, she said, because he wanted to understand why I stayed. He said he was curious. She looked at Seok-ryong. That's not a casual observation. He called because I'm a variable he can't categorize, and things he can't categorize become threats. Yes, which means he's going to keep watching. Yes. Then let him watch, she said quietly. Seok-ryong looked at her. You have an idea, he said. I have the beginning of one. She picked up her coffee. Aunurnam, I need access to international pharmaceutical shipping records for my fellowship presentation. He was quiet for a moment. The presentation. Yes, it's on resource distribution across international medical supply routes. She held his gaze with complete steadiness. Is there a reason that's a problem? He looked at her for a long, measuring moment. And something in his expression began to shift. The careful reordering of a man who has just realized that the variable he was trying to manage was not a liability at all. No, he said slowly. No problem. Good, she said. I'll need database access by this afternoon. The retaliation came on the third night. Seok had expected it. Min Seok's pattern was predictable in its aggression, if not in its timing. He had his people positioned. He believed the situation was managed. He was wrong about the entry point. They came through the service level at 2:30 in the morning, and the tower's lower security was briefly overwhelmed before the upper floors could respond. There was a controlled breach. 1-2 of Seok men were down on the 36th floor, and Seok himself, moving through a corridor his own people hadn't cleared, took a bullet that grazed his left shoulder and punched through to the muscle beneath. He got himself to the secured central room on 38. His men converged. 3 of them began the evacuation protocol. Remove Han Seok from the building, seal the floor, neutralize the threat from outside. What he was telling them to stand down when Ifunanya walked in. She had heard the gunfire. She had assessed the sounds, locations, distances, directions, and moved toward the central room, which was the only sensible place to be in a secured tower under attack. She took one look at Seok standing, bleeding, arguing in Korean with men trying to steer him toward an exit, and she crossed the room. "Stop," she said. She said it with the voice she used in trauma bays when everyone was moving too fast, and the patient was the only still point that mattered. They stopped. She assessed the wound, looked at Seok face, pallor, eye clarity, jaw tension. "Sit down," she said. "The protocol," he started. "Your protocol can wait 8 minutes. Your arterial response cannot." She looked at the men. "Clear this table. Bring me the kit from room 3802. Red bag, bathroom cabinet, boil water, get me actual light. Move." They moved. They moved because she moved first. And the tone of someone who knows what they're doing is unmistakable in a crisis, regardless of the language it's delivered in. Seok sat. She worked. The dining table became what she needed it to become. The field kit from her room had been packed with the thoroughness of a surgeon who had worked in enough resource-limited environments to know that you pack for the worst version of events, not the expected one. Seok did not make a sound. She glanced up at him once. His eyes were on her face, not on what her hands were doing, which she understood was about trust and about the particular dignity of men who have decided that surrendering to someone's competence is different from surrendering. "You're going to feel the clamp," she said. "Do it." 11 minutes. She sealed the wound, covered it, stepped back, and breathed out slowly. "Your men on 36, she said. What are their conditions?" "1 GSW to the leg, 1 blunt trauma to the head," Taejin said. "Bring them here. Now." They looked at Seok. He nodded. Once. She worked for another 40 minutes, moving between the 2 injured men with the methodical focus of someone who had done this in worse conditions with less. She had done this in a village hospital in Imo State, with a generator running off a half-empty diesel tank, with a child on the table and a family outside the door. She had done this. She did it now. When she finished, she sat in a chair and drank water and let her hands rest still in her lap. After a while, she heard slow, careful footsteps. Seok sat in the chair across from her. They were quiet. "You've done this before," he said finally. "Not in a place like this." "No," she said. "Not in a place like this." "Where?" "Everywhere that needed it," she said. He looked at her for a long time, not the way he'd watched her across the reception hall. And this was different. This was the look of someone encountering something that has permanently reorganized a category. "From this moment," he said quietly, "I stopped thinking of you as someone who needs to be protected." She looked at him. "Good," she said. "You should have stopped 6 minutes into our first conversation. Drop a comment right now. Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" This woman doesn't flinch. Subscribe and keep watching. The next part changes everything. The international liaison's name was Park Sung-woo, and he arrived on the 38th floor on the 4th morning with a diplomatic case and a professionally calibrated expression. New travel document, secured transfer to Gimhae Airport, direct flight to Lagos via Hong Kong. Her name removed from the summit's attendance records. The fellowship flagged as an administrative withdrawal. No record of the last 4 days remaining in any system. Home within 24 hours. She sat with this for a long time. She thought about Lagos, about Enugu, About the hospital where the Okafor boy had eaten breakfast and where the pediatric ward monitors beeped their steady rhythms. She thought about her phone, which had 3 missed calls from Dr. Adays and one message that simply read, "If, where are you? The pediatric conference in Abuja. They needed your confirmation by yesterday. Did you submit it?" She stared at that message. The Abuja conference. The pediatric trauma symposium she had spent 4 months preparing for. A paper on post-operative complications in under-resourced environments. Work that had taken her 2 years to compile. The submission deadline had been yesterday. She had missed it, not because she had forgotten it, but because yesterday she had been stabilizing 2 gunshot wounds on a dining table in a secured tower in Busan. She had missed it. She set the phone down and looked at the harbor. She thought about Min Seok, about shipping records, about cargo that wasn't declared on manifests, about the routes she had been building in her research, the cross-referencing of pharmaceutical shipping data against transit anomalies in Pacific Corridor logistics. Work that had started as fellowship research and had become something considerably more specific. She thought about the fact that the routes Min Seok was using were pharmaceutical corridors, medical supply chains, the same channels that moved resources to the hospitals she worked with, the communities she treated. When those channels were compromised, children died, not dramatically, quietly, because medications didn't arrive, because supply chains were unreliable. She looked at Park Sung-woo. "No," she said. He blinked. "Dr. E is... I understand the offer. I'm declining it. The risk to your personal safety is something I'm capable of assessing myself." She stood. "I'm a trauma surgeon. I calculate acceptable risk ratios professionally. May I ask why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because running would allow men like Min Seok to keep deciding outcomes. Because I don't disappear to make violent men comfortable." Park Sung-woo had no immediate response. She showed him to the door. In the corridor, she turned and found Sok Rae-young standing 10 meters behind her. He had heard. She met his eyes. His expression was not gratitude, deeper than gratitude. The look of a man who has spent years building structures around himself and has just watched someone walk through them without trying. She said, "I missed the Abuja conference submission." A pause. "What was it?" 2 years of research, pediatric trauma complications in under-resourced environments. The paper I was going to submit. She said it steadily, without drama. The deadline was yesterday. He was quiet. "I'm not telling you so you'll apologize," she said. "Well, I'm telling you so you understand that staying here has a cost. And I've calculated the cost, and I'm still choosing to stay. But you should know what's on the ledger." "Yes," he said quietly. "I should know." She nodded once and went back to her research. Jung Min Seok received his intelligence every morning in a briefing that covered 12 data points across 3 cities. On the 5th morning, the briefing contained a single line that made him set down his coffee. "Dr. Easy has declined extraction. Reason, unknown." He stared at it. He had offered the extraction framework through Park Sung-woo, who worked for people who occasionally worked for Min Seok. It was clean, safe, and any rational person should have taken it. She had refused. Or he didn't understand this. Things he didn't understand became threats immediately. He had called her himself. He was not given to direct contact with unknowns, but he had been genuinely curious. She had answered with complete steadiness, had not flinched at his voice, had not performed fear or bravado, had simply asked questions and held the line. He had told his operations lead, full file, everything. The file told him very little that surprised him. Excellent medical record, the decorated academic career, no political connections, no prior exposure to organized crime environments, no financial incentive to stay. "She has no reason to be here," he said. "No," his operations lead agreed, "which means either Sok Rae-young has offered her something we don't know about," he paused, "or she is operating on a logic we haven't identified." He thought about this for a while. Then, "She's a researcher. What is her fellowship project specifically?" His operations lead checked. Checked again, then looked up slowly. "Pharmaceutical shipping routes," he said. "Pacific Corridor logistics, specifically transit anomalies in medical supply chains." Silence. Min Seok understood, in the specific cellular way that experienced operators understand when a threat has materialized, exactly what Ifunanya Is was doing in that tower on the 38th floor. "Pull our people back from the tower," he said. "Sir, pull them back, now, and get me a full audit of what's publicly accessible in the international pharmaceutical shipping databases." He picked up his coffee. "She's not in that tower because she's afraid to leave." He looked at the harbor through his window. "She's in that tower because she's building something." What Ifunanya had built in 48 hours was a map, not a metaphorical one, and an actual reconstruction of pharmaceutical supply chain anomalies across 14 shipping routes over 18 months. Routes that corresponded precisely to transit corridors under Han Logistics Group's operational umbrella. Routes where cargo listed as medical supplies had moved through ports with processing times inconsistent with their declared contents. Routes where financial trails, cross-referenced with publicly available Port Authority filings, it revealed payment structures that didn't match legitimate pharmaceutical logistics. She wasn't a forensic accountant. She wasn't an investigator. She was a trauma surgeon who had navigated international medical supply chains in under-resourced environments for 6 years, and she knew, with specificity, that Min Seok's intelligence people could not have anticipated exactly what legitimate pharmaceutical shipping looked like, and what it didn't. If she brought the map to Seakyong on the 5th evening, he looked at it for a long time without speaking. "This is Min Seok's network," he said finally. "It's visible from medical supply records. The routes he's using were originally pharmaceutical logistics corridors. Legitimate ones. The anomalies are obvious if you know what pharmaceutical transit should look like. His financial partners are investors in legitimate medical logistics firms. Yes, and if they saw this data, they would understand that their investment is covering trafficking routes, and they would understand that this documentation, if it reached the right regulatory bodies, would name them as connected parties." He looked at her. "You built this in 48 hours. I had the databases and I knew what I was looking for." "Why?" he said. "Why what? You could have left. You could have handed this to Shungwoo's people and let them process it. You could have stayed in your room and completed your research and never engaged with any of this." He looked at her steadily. "Why are you still here?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because the thing I walked into in that corridor wasn't just about you and Min Seok. The routes he's using were pharmaceutical corridors. These are the same channels that move resources to the hospitals I work with. When those channels are compromised, children die. Not dramatically, quietly." She paused. "The Abuja paper I missed. It was about exactly this. Supply chain integrity and patient outcomes. I've spent 2 years writing about how invisible failures in logistics kill people at the end of the line." She looked at him. "I'm not going to sit 40 meters away from the source of one of those failures and do nothing." He held her gaze. "That's why I'm here," she said. "Not for you." "I know," he said quietly. A pause. "I know," he said again, and this time it meant something different. The documentation reached Min Seok's 4 primary financial partners simultaneously at 9:45 on a Thursday morning. Not through legal channels, not yet. Through private, encrypted communication to the personal counsel of each investor, with a cover note that outlined, with clinical precision, what the attached data demonstrated and what regulatory exposure would look like if it reached the Korea Financial Intelligence Unit, the WHO's Medical Supply Integrity Office, or in 2 specific international trade oversight committees already investigating Pacific Corridor anomalies. The note did not threaten. It informed. It also noted that the documentation was currently held by parties with significant interest in a resolution that did not require public disclosure, and that the window for such resolution was approximately 72 hours. What happened next took 6. Min Seok's primary financial partner, a Seoul-based infrastructure fund, had their legal team on the phone with Min Seok within 40 minutes. The conversation was short and unambiguous. They were withdrawing their capital positions, effective immediately. No further association. The second partner followed within an hour. The third 2 hours later. Kaba IV, a Japanese logistics conglomerate, lasted until 4 in the afternoon before their board voted unanimously to execute the same withdrawal. Without capital backing, without the financial architecture that had supported his network's expansion, Jang Min-suk's operation did not collapse loudly. It deflated. Precisely, in the way that systems deflate when their structural support is removed. Quickly, completely, without spectacle. There was no shootout. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was a man in a Busan hotel suite, alone with his phone, watching call after call go unanswered. He sat for a long time. Then he made one final call. It connected on the second ring. "Tell Han," he said quietly, "that the woman was the variable I should have taken seriously earlier." The line went dead. He left the country before evening. By morning, Seakyong had the confirmation. He went to the suite at the end of the corridor and knocked. Funanya opened the door. She had her laptop under her arm. She was already dressed for the hospital. Dr. Park Jin-ho was expecting her for the final observation day she hadn't been able to attend during the chaos. "It's over," he said. She looked at him. "Min-seok?" "Gone. The network is finished." She nodded once. "Good." She adjusted the laptop. "I have to get to the hospital. One more observation day and a presentation to finish." He looked at her. "Gatti, that's all you have to say?" "No," she said. "I also want to say that the documentation has been forwarded to the WHO Medical Supply Integrity Office and the Korea FIU. Not because I don't trust your resolution, but because the routes themselves need to be formally closed, and that requires a process neither of us controls." She met his eyes. "You should know that." A pause. "I know," he said. "Good." She moved past him into the corridor. "Dr. Easy." She stopped. "The Abuja conference," he said. "Why, the paper you missed. My logistics group has a relationship with 3 of the organizations co-sponsoring next year's symposium. I can make an introduction, if that's useful." She turned and looked at him. Not with warmth exactly, with the particular assessment of someone deciding whether an offer is what it presents itself as. "That's not a debt," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's a correction. There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Andrew, send me the contact information," she said, and walked toward the elevator. 3 weeks later, the fellowship was complete. The presentation had been delivered on resource-limited surgical intervention with a specific section on pharmaceutical supply chain integrity and its relationship to patient outcomes in African medical facilities. The panel had been attentive. One member had asked her to submit the research component for publication consideration in an international health policy journal. She was flying home the next day. The night before her final day in Busan, her phone rang. "There's a harbor walk," Seakyong's voice said, "at the southern end of the district. Quiet before 6 in the morning." "Why are you telling me this?" A pause. "I'll be there at 5:30 if you want to walk." She looked at the ceiling. 5:30, she said. "Yes." She ended the call. The harbor at 5:30 was the city in its most unperformed state. The light was gray and moving. Container ships moved through the outer channel, in their bulk incongruous against the quiet. He was already there when she arrived. Dark coat, no suit, hands in his pockets, looking at the water. She fell into step beside him. For a while neither of them spoke. The harbor moved around them. The occasional call of a dock worker, the low engine sound of a vessel in the channel, water against pilings. "You're going home tomorrow," he said. "Yes." "Your hospital." "Yes." "The Okafor boy," he said. She had mentioned the case to him once, briefly. She glanced at him. "He was discharged last week. His mother sent me a photograph." He nodded. They walked. A ship moved past on the outer channel, large, deliberate, following a route that had been decided for it by mathematics and history. "I have spent my life," he said, not looking at her, "making sure that nothing could reach me, building systems that kept every variable at a manageable distance." A pause. "It works for a long time. Until it stops working." She walked beside him and listened. "You walked in," he said, "and you refused to move. You refused to be managed. You refused the extraction. You refused to disappear." Another pause. "You stayed because you chose to." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't stay for you," she said. "I know that," he said. And the way he said it was not wounded. It was, she recognized it now, relieved. Kind of the relief of someone who has spent years surrounded by people who did everything for him, who finds something that operates on entirely different logic. "I stayed because the situation required staying in," she said, because running would have meant accepting that the outcome wasn't mine to influence. And I have a hard time accepting that. He turned to look at her. The Abuja paper, he said. The conference next year. Will you submit it? The director of the symposium reached out last week, she said. Apparently an introduction was made. And I'm submitting. A pause. Thank you for the correction. He nodded. They walked a little further. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want you to answer honestly, not kindly. I don't know how to answer unkindly, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Ifunanya. Her name in his voice, with that specific weight. Even when you go home, he said carefully, I would like to maintain contact, not as a favor, not as an obligation, because I haven't, in a very long time, encountered someone whose way of being in the world I found this. He paused, selecting the word, clarifying. She was quiet. The harbor moved. Clarifying, she repeated. Yes. She thought about Lagos, about Enugu, about the hospital and the ward, and the work that was specific and grounded and entirely her own. She thought about this man, his controlled stillness, his one moment of overreach when he'd removed her hospital days from the schedule, the way she had shut it down and he had, after 4 full seconds, let her. The way he had sat in a chair and let her work without performing toughness. The look on his face when he'd heard her refuse the extraction. She thought about distance. Lagos to Busan was not a short flight. His world and hers did not share geography, did not share language, did not share the daily texture of what it meant to be inside them. She understood that these were not small things. These were the things that wore down even intentions that were genuine. She had watched relationships collapse under less. I don't know what this is, she said carefully. Neither do I, he said. And I'm not, she paused. I'm not interested in a dynamic that requires me to keep proving something or to fit into a structure that was built without me in mind. When that's not something I'll sustain. I understand that. Do you? He looked at her. Yes, because I've spent 14 years sustaining a dynamic that required me to be untouchable. I understand what that costs. A pause. I'm not proposing to import that into whatever this would be. She looked at him for a long moment. Maintaining contact, she said. That's a deliberately modest way to put it. Yes, he said, because you're not sure I'll agree to anything more. Yes, and you decided, she said slowly, that starting from honest uncertainty is better than performing confidence you don't have. Yes, she absorbed this. Then yes, she said, contact is fine. Not a declaration, not a surrender. A decision made with clear eyes by someone who knew the difference between choosing and being chosen. He nodded once. The harbor light was changing, gray becoming gold at the edge of the water. Eke the first suggestion of actual morning. She said, I didn't come here to be chosen. He said nothing, waiting. I stayed, she said, because I chose. A pause. I know, he said quietly. That's why it means something. The water moved, the light shifted. Somewhere in the outer channel, a container ship altered its course, adjusting for the morning current, for the new geometry of the day ahead. Not because it had been commanded to, because the route required it. Yet if you made it to the end, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Tell me in the comments, when did it get you? Was it when she refused to disappear? When she told him what the Abuja paper cost her? Or was it that final line at the harbor? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to see it, like it so more people find it, and subscribe to K-Diaspora because the next story is already coming, and I promise it hits even harder. See you in the next one.